Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Liam Collins, a former Wharton student and the founder of Proxis. Hi, Liam. Where are you joining in from today?
Hey, Julian. Great to see you again, and it's a pleasure to be on. I'm calling in from San Francisco, where we're based now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining the podcast. I'm super excited to do this. For those of you who don't know, Liam was actually part of my class at Wharton and then dropped out to start a startup, which is super exciting. And we're going to hear a little bit more about what he's doing during this podcast. Before we sort of dive into any specifics, Liam, can you sort of talk us through what is the startup that you founded? What do they do? What is the product? And ultimately, what drove you to start this?
So Proxis is the LLM distillation and fine-tuning platform. So what that means is we make models run cheaper and faster. For example, one of our customers uses our custom, highly optimized LLMs to make generative UI for websites. And they do that at 1/10 of the cost and 10x the speed of what any closed source alternative would be able to provide. So that's Proxis as the platform. And the genesis of Proxis came from a previous startup that we were building before in the healthcare industry. We were automating prior authorizations, and we were building fine-tuned and distilled models, and realized that you had to be really technically savvy to get these things to work well. And we decided to take a step back and to build these for every vertical, healthcare and otherwise. And we wanted to make it the easiest and best way to upload your data and get an extremely custom model that could run very quickly. So that was the catalyst for starting Proxis.
Got it. Sounds super interesting. I'm sure we're going to dive into a little bit more detail on what distillation is, because I'm sure the audience would love to know, but I think that's a great overview to start with. Can you also just walk us through what is your background? So you sort of mentioned you came from this healthcare startup background, but what were you doing before coming to Wharton, and why did you decide to make this leap into applying for YC and starting this company?
My background is as a software engineer. I taught myself to code and ended up working as a software engineer for a couple of years before going and doing grad school. And while I was in grad school, I met Jackson through a great mutual friend of ours who also happened to do YC. Jackson is my co-founder, and he was a ML researcher at Google, also had a master's in CS. And we were introduced through this mutual friend because we were working on the same project. We were working on automating prior authorizations in healthcare. Jackson and I met one another. We both ended up being cyclists, really hit it off, and decided that it was really fortuitous. We were working on the same idea. We may as well give this a full punt. And we did it. So we started working on that project together. We decided to apply to YC with not much traction, but a lot of chutzpah. And we were fortunate to get in. And that was the catalyst for us moving out to San Francisco and for starting the company full time.
And just to help me better understand, how did it go to the LLM distillation sort of business from this healthcare sort of pre-authorization? It sounds like there was sort of a pivot along the journey. So could you walk us through sort of how that sort of happened?
Definitely. So we joined YC working on the healthcare startup. And like I mentioned earlier, realized that fine-tuning and distilling these LLMs, which is exactly what we needed in this specific application in healthcare, was incredibly difficult to do, and you needed to be very technically savvy. So we set out on the mission to how do we empower those who are not as technically savvy to really build their own custom fine-tuned models where you're able to go upload a data set and then have a custom model there for you. So midway through the batch, we ended up pivoting into this AI infrastructure side of things rather than the healthcare specific place, so that we could address all these verticals, healthcare, government, you name it. We'd be able to serve people and those to better empower them. So we made that pivot midway through the batch. And a little fun aside, we decided that we recognized we were surrounded by some of the best brains in the startup community in YC and decided to leverage that. So we ended up throwing a pivot party where we got a piñata and everyone put their ideas in the piñata. We smashed it open and read some of them. Not that we went with any of those, but very interesting ones there. We knew exactly where we were going and what we wanted to build. We thought we'd have some fun along the way.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can imagine that being in the YC community must be quite an interesting environment given how strong of a cohort it really is. Could you talk us through sort of what attracted you to the AI space? Because it sounded like pretty early on you're sort of interested in computer science and sort of taught yourself how to code. But then more specifically with the healthcare business and now Proxis was really keyed into sort of the AI space and leveraging it to drive better business outcomes. So what was sort of the impetus for that interest?
Yeah. I've always been a builder and really wanted to create things. Hence, when I taught myself to code, I went into web development. And really what was fulfilling for me was to be able to point something to something and say, hey, I built that. That was me. And really, I'd been diving into data science courses and some ML in undergrad and in grad school. And it had been of interest for me, but I'd never done it full time. And really thought about it and said, hey, if I want to build, what is the biggest value add and the biggest source of value in future that's going to be on the frontier in the AI space? This is where I want to be going forward. And had that realization in grad school and really set out to build something along those lines. And Proxis was the catalyst to be able to do that full time and to be able to build in that space. And that's where I want to be long term. In terms of Jackson, my co-founder, he's been in the space for well before it was cool. And he'd been studying this from the get-go and had been working in ML research for a long time. And so to be able to find someone who is just the top of their field in that space and whom I respect so deeply was such a benefit, and so grateful for that, and to be able to start the company with him as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially like, as you mentioned, it's such a rapidly evolving space. So latching yourself to something like that definitely makes a lot of sense. On the flip side, it is a rapidly evolving space and the underlying LLMs are rapidly changing. The landscape, the business models are sort of like a really diverse array of options at this point, and they're changing week over week. So how do you sort of see the role of Proxis 2-3 years from now when maybe like the underlying LLMs and the technology have gotten a lot better and maybe it is like already cheap enough and quick enough to run sort of larger Gen AI models? How does that maybe impact your product? Does it make it even stronger and more supercharged, or will it sort of pivot into something else?
As models improve, we improve. And we've set ourselves up to take that bet that ultimately we are open source and we work on open source models. Our view is that open source will remain state of the art and there will be frequent releases of state of the art models. And with those comes business to Proxis. Effectively, with new foundational models, which are generalist in nature, as those are released, there's a need for fine-tuning on those and distillation in order to condense them for specific use cases. And really the move there is that Proxis is well positioned for any improvements in the open source community. And as we think about where we're going forward, foundational models are built to be generalists. And that has been the position of a lot of the closed source providers like your OpenAI and such. Proxis, by virtue of what we're building on these custom LLMs, is perfectly positioned to be verticalized foundational agents. So what I mean for that is we're building custom models for every sort of vertical, like I mentioned earlier in the healthcare space, but can be others as well. And we're set up to offer those as out-of-the-box solutions to folks who want to build agents or LLMs on those verticals. So if you as a healthcare startup with minimal production data come to us and say, hey, we want this very custom fine-tuned agent or LLM, we have that healthcare foundation where we're able to offer that verticalized model. And then even with sparse data, you're able to fine-tune it to get that extra step of the way and to get to that very specific use case.
I think this is a great segue to trying to understand maybe the product a little bit more. So could you walk us through what does the onboarding look like in terms of what does the client need to do? And then ultimately, how does it run? Is it still you're running on the servers of many of the cloud providers? Is it plugged into OpenAI, Anthropic, whoever your model sort of generator of choice is? Just kind of curious to understand a little bit more that client and product journey.
We are fundamentally open source and we work with open source models. We aren't plugged into any of the closed source providers like OpenAI and such. What it looks like is a customer will come to us with a set of data and they'd upload that data onto the platform. And this is the data that'll be used to first fine-tune and then distill the model. We've built it as an easy self-serve platform where you can come in, put your data in, and effectively receive a distilled model at the end of it. So what's going on under the hood is that data is being uploaded. You'd select an open source model, call it a large state-of-the-art model, Llama 405B. The data will be run through that and fine-tuned on that model. What will then happen is once we have that state-of-the-art fine-tuned model, we'll undergo the distillation process. And the distillation process is when you can kind of think of it as it's this teacher-student model dynamic. So you take the large open source model that we've just fine-tuned, and that becomes the teacher model. Then we take a much smaller model, and that becomes the student model. Now, when we feed that data through the teacher model, the smaller student model is looking at the outputs of that teacher model and learning from them, specifically looking at the logic layer outputs. And what the student model can then do is replicate what the teacher model did and retain much of that accuracy on the specific task, because it's only seen the data that's come in and out of that teacher model. And so now the student model is basically as good as that teacher model, but it's a fraction of the size and it works really fast. And that is what we deliver back to the end customer is, hey, here's your open source student model, and you can do what you will with that. Either we will host it for you, or you can host it yourselves on-prem, which I'm happy to go deeper into as well. And that's really the whole process from the customer standpoint. It just looks like, here's our data. We need a fine-tuned model for this specific use case, and we will get you back that fine-tuned model. And because it's open source, you own that model.
Yeah, totally. I guess my next question is around the training costs. I imagine it's a lot more limited than training a large general LLM. And given that it's just ultimately you're working off of a pre-built base and you're trying to make it a smaller thing. So I imagine it's still a lot smaller, but is that still a significant cost that occurs up front for your customers? Or is it really inconsequential now that you're sort of already working off of an LLM and a source model that's been already trained and built, ultimately just kind of doing a small adjustment to it?
When you're operating at scale, like a lot of our customers are, the training cost is relatively immaterial to the cost savings that you have with a distilled model. Some of the folks are running at millions of dollars of compute costs. When we bring that down in a distilled model, the benefits of those far outweigh the training costs. The second thing I'd say on that is that we're able to optimize at every step of the way. Jackson has a lot of experience on low-level optimizations on GPUs and on TPUs as well. And we're able to effectively make that fine-tuning process or the distillation process in general as optimized as we can to bring those training costs down for the folks that we work with. Really, in the bigger scheme of things, yes, it is a cost. There is compute required to train those, but it's far outweighed by the benefits of having that distilled model.
Is there effectively, at this point, anything sort of stopping the larger AI players from doing something similar at this stage? Or I guess like what's preventing them from kind of moving into this market themselves, given that they probably already have the distribution, the brand name, and a lot of this sort of know-how in-house?
So on October 1st, OpenAI released their press release of the distillation service that they offer, which has been of great benefit to us because it catalyzed the education around the distillation space. In some senses, we thought we'd seen distillation in the closed source communities and how valuable it was at companies like Google and such. And we thought we may have been too early in the space when we started building there. And really, when OpenAI came out with that release, it was beneficial for us because customers started coming to us. OpenAI, you're able to distill with them, but effectively in some of those, you are locked into their closed source ecosystem where you are then locked into inference using OpenAI. And where we stand, Proxis builds on open source models. You own those models. Customers who wanted to effectively distill and then own their models after, whether that be we would host their models, they'd host it on-prem or even on device for ODML use cases, on-device machine learning, those are the folks that really we are catering for. And we're staying abreast with where we benefit is we're staying abreast with the most up-to-date and highly frontier open source models. So we benefit from that. Really, there are alternatives in the closed source community, but when it comes to building on open source models and distilling there, having the easiest platform to just drop in your data and receive a distilled model is where we come in as Proxis.
Totally. What is the life cycle of one of these distilled models? I mean, you're so early on in your business, so it's probably a little bit hard to tell, but we've sort of seen the depreciation of ChatGPT 3, and now we're on to ChatGPT 3.5, 4, 4.5, so on and so forth. And it's a rapidly moving space. So do you expect to sort of like retrain your clients' models, or your clients are going to come to you asking for a new model every time the next llama comes out? Or is there sort of like a longer life cycle for these models?
It's a continuous process. There's a number of factors that come into play here. One of them is model drift, which we keep closely attuned with, where you can think of it like some data may become stale, or you have new production data that comes in that you want to train on in order to keep the model well aligned with the use case. That's something that rejustifies either another train, doesn't have to be a full fine tune, but it may become another distillation. The other part of it, like you mentioned, is having new frontier models that are released. And we're well set up in order to redistill on those frontier models so that customers are able to have the state-of-the-art models for their use cases. So in that sense, it is a bit of a continuous process. We don't expect these to just sit there and become stale. But to the extent, for some of them, if they're using them and they are performing at the level with which they want them to, then it makes sense to continue on. You don't have to upgrade to the latest model or keep fine-tuning for the fear of model drift. So really, it's a case-by-case basis. But the beauty of this is that we're able to just act so quickly on when those new models come out that all of these customers have access to the latest and greatest open source models.
That's fascinating to sort of hear how it can maybe last a little bit longer and almost even evolve as sort of the clients use them more, which is incredible to see. I kind of want to shift gears a bit now to talking about your business model, because I know this has been sort of like a lot of area of divergence and exploration when it comes to the AI space. Traditionally, SaaS products were built on a per seat or per usage basis, but I think AI sort of really turns that on its head in terms of you're no longer necessarily using it on a per seat basis, and it's more about the usage or the value that it creates. So I'm curious to sort of understand how you guys are thinking about maybe trying to capture that value from your clients, and what does the fee structure look like? I imagine there's maybe something upfront in terms of the model training, but is there any sort of recurring revenue? What does that look like?
So fundamentally, we're open source, and we've positioned ourselves like that because we believe getting these Proxis tools in the hands of developers so they can play around with them, they can see the value in that tool set, is where a lot of the value comes from. And we want to develop that trust with developers and engineers, where we want to say, hey, use our tools. If they work for you, then great. Let's engage in an enterprise plan down the line. We view that as the best way of supporting AI growth when it comes to AI researchers and engineers, and to support ultimately the journey toward AGI. Where we come in on the cost side of things, our fees scale with compute. So to the extent folks are running much bigger training jobs or serving much larger inference is where costs would go up for them on that side of things. But really, we also fundamentally see where the value is, and we're charging for value creation. So to the extent we do that, and we're saving folks millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in compute, then that's how we structure our fees according to that. So we don't charge on a per seat basis per se, but have enterprise contracts that are built on top of an open source platform.
Got it. Okay. So it sounds like a little bit more of using the open source aspect of the business to sort of get people familiar with it. And then eventually, once they get sort of up to speed and understand the value proposition, that's where you sort of make the transition into more of a client relationship, so to speak.
That's right. And there are also a lot of features that are offered on the enterprise plan that aren't explicitly offered on the open source plan. And then there's much more of a bespoke custom value add that we add on top of that enterprise plan as well for a lot of bigger clients. But we really wanted to get into the hands of everyone because we believe a lot of developers deserve the ability to use those tools and to build on top of them. And if we can empower developers to build their own custom LLMs, then that's exactly what we're here for.
When you sort of offer to host the service, I imagine that it is, you guys don't have a whole data center, so you're running off of many of the current hyperscalers. Is it sort of cloud service provider agnostic, or Is there certain ones that it works better with or that you prefer to work with?
We've set ourselves up to be agnostic toward cloud providers. To the extent we can optimize to run on certain hardware, then we do. But really, for those hosting processes, to host inference, we just don't want to have our customers have to think about any of the back-end infrastructure if they opt into a service like that. Really, it's a turnkey. Give us your data and we'll give you back a model that you can query directly. So for the moment being, we are running on cloud providers. That may change in future. We just want to get those costs to a place where they can be palatable and to really provide the best experience at the lowest cost that we can for those customers. So to the extent that means moving away from one cloud provider to another or eventually deploying on our own infrastructure, then that's the direction that we would head.
And do most of your clients use it in like an AI agent form where it is actually going about and executing tasks, or is it integration into their existing product to sort of augment a chat function or help employees out? Trying to understand the use case that a lot of people have.
Yeah, so a lot of it is integrating it with the services that they already have or building out new services that they're offering using these custom LLMs that we're building for them. So, for example, I mentioned the generative UI website where they're able to generate new UI in real time, and all you need is a backend for this website. That's something that runs at significant scale, and so costs are material in that sense, and something that you also need to be highly performant to be able to run those models very quickly and output that UI. So for that use case, the distilled model was something that they built on top of. That's where the majority of our customers are building in now. The agentic frameworks are verticalized agentic frameworks are where we see it going down the line as well.
Super fascinating. I think for a lot of people, we have the experience of interacting with Gen AI through LLMs, but it's already clear how it's drastically changing in the way that a lot of companies are leveraging it. So I think it's a fascinating evolution that I'm sure a lot of us are going to see more once we start re-entering back into the workplace. So cool to see the variety of use cases. I now want to sort of transition a bit to understanding your YC experience and process. I think a lot of people have a general understanding of what YC is and know the brand and know what some of the startups that have come out of it, but don't really know what that experience looks like. So can you maybe just walk us through sort of why did you pick YC? And maybe what was the most impactful part about being a member of YC?
So YC is a 3-month program. You meet with your group partner and with your small section of about 10 companies every week. And it's a 3-month sprint towards demo day where you raise your seed round. Really, it's 3 of the most productive months of your life. And there's a lot that we learned through that YC process. The first thing that comes to mind is the velocity with which you can build at. For example, sitting in those conversations with our batchmates of the other 10 companies, having set goals for the next 2 weeks and someone coming back saying, hey, I've booked another 5, 10K MRR. That's the benchmark that's set. And it really opens your eyes up to how quickly you can actually build and leveraging things like selling before building or these learnings that come from within your section that you can then leverage yourself. So it was actually very special to see how vulnerable everyone can be in those small sections. And because of that vulnerability, you can learn a lot more and you can see, everyone is going through these setbacks or mini failures, and this is how they're bouncing back from it. And this is what's working, this is what's not. And really, as a group of 10 companies, you end up being so much better as a whole because of that. Really, it's learning to do things that don't scale. For example, sitting down with every one of your customers or getting them little mugs as a thank you, the things that just would not work at a billion-dollar scale company, but that do work in the early stages. And so really learning from that, learning from the velocity, from the group partners. There's an ecosystem that YC generates that is really just unparalleled by any other program or accelerator.
Do you think a lot of the benefits for you came from being in this cohort of other exceptional founders and sort of like the competition and the motivation that provided to you? Or was there also sort of like intrinsic values of the mentors that you received or programming from YC? So maybe the more traditional quote unquote like school or mentorship aspects.
There's immense value in all of those. I would agree with all of the above. We learned from even the YC alumni base has been incredibly helpful in terms of being able to reach out to any YC alum and have them very keen and excited to speak with you, and having all the YC alum come and speak with us every week. Folks from DoorDash, Airbnb, AWS, you name it. Well, AWS wasn't an alum, but folks that are really still so integrated into the YC community. It's not something that is just a 3-month program and then you leave. The other part of it is, like I mentioned, building alongside those people who are other batchmates who are also building billion-dollar companies and being in that process with them from the get-go and seeing them at an early stage and seeing that just a lot of it are these small failures, and already it is being able to roll with those punches and keep coming back failure after failure and try again and pivoting is what makes these companies succeed. And ultimately, in the end, it's YC says surviving long enough to succeed, where if you're able to keep going through those many failures and just to keep shipping products throughout that, then it's just a question of time before you succeed.
Yeah. This is maybe slightly off script, but because you brought it up, I'm just curious if you're comfortable sharing what was maybe one of those early failures that Proxis had, and what was maybe some of the biggest learnings from it. I'm sure you've had your lefts and your rights kind of not always go in the direction that you wanted. So I'm just curious if there's a particular story that you think is resonant.
I'd say in the beginning, one of the failures that we encountered pretty early on is when we were building our first company in the healthcare space, where we went into the space with not much background in healthcare at all, where we didn't really have the networks to get in front of people. And so we really had to hustle to get in front of the potential customers, especially at larger hospitals. And really what we realized very quickly was that enterprise sales, especially enterprise sales within healthcare, has a really long lead time. And some of the bigger hospitals we were speaking to, even though they saw immense value in the product, saying, hey, this would save us hours and hours of time, a ton of value, he said, we would probably be able to get this integrated in the next 3 years. And for us, it wasn't necessarily a failure, but more of a wake-up call of, wow, these things do take a lot of time, and there is a lot of effort that needs to go in to shorten that time frame. And that's just a question of how good are you at sales and reducing that time frame. It just goes to show that a lot of the companies, even with a great idea and something that would work really well, one of them that comes to mind is DoorDash, it took a lot of effort and a lot of hustle to get that off the ground, going into restaurants every day and being with them in order to get people to start using the product. So even a great product where there is a lot of value, it's just really difficult from like a distribution and sales process to get that off the ground. And that's where a founder with hustle and energy and just an indefatigable drive really sets those companies apart, where it's not just the idea, it's a lot. Most of it is on the execution.
Yeah. It comes down to it. I think every founder realizes that sales is just such an important part of the game. And I think for every job, everything kind of always comes down to sales, whether you're selling an idea internally or selling your product externally. A lot of the same skill sets apply, and it's super important. It's something I wish they taught actually at business school, is like a sales class, because there's a lot that goes into it, and it's a crucial part of the business. Is there right now a target customer or demographic that you're going after? I mean, it seems like you sort of tried in the healthcare space. It does have notorious long lead times. Is there sort of like a particular area or industry that you're seeing a lot of success in today, or is it actually fairly distributed in terms of who's seeing a lot of value in the product right now?
So ultimately, performance and optimization is for everyone. So we have quite a wide array of customers that we could sell to. Really, Proxis is selling to developers. We're structuring towards anyone who wants to make custom LLMs or LLMs that run really performant. And on top of that, because we're open source and you own your models, we've seen some industries really take to this. For example, those highly indexed on privacy and security, thinking, like I mentioned, the healthcare player where you want to deploy on-prem, or government where security would be a major concern, and to be able to own those models and have them isolated on your own premises is something of big value there. So it's mainly towards those players and developers. But at this stage, like I say, that base is pretty broad.
I now want to change gears one more time into sort of understanding your journey as a founder. I think entrepreneurship is almost something that you're born into rather than built into in some sense. I think a lot of great entrepreneurs start early, whether it's selling lemonade or burning DVDs and selling them to kids at school. Have you known that you wanted to be a founder for a long time? And did you start early in life and have some random businesses when you were in high school or even in undergrad?
So when I was in undergrad, I was interviewing for investment banking jobs, and I got so frustrated with the number of the same interviews I had to go through. So I paired up with a technical co-founder, and we'd started something which at its foundation was an app where you could do one first round interview and be able to share that with every person that you'd applied with for a job. And that would kind of encapsulate your generalist questions and who you were. We applied for some accelerators. We didn't get into any. And eventually my co-founder got pretty busy and I was not able to take the app to the next stage because I couldn't code any of it. And eventually that petered out and died. And that was really, for me, the genesis of this need and want to be able to build myself, to empower myself to learn to code so that I could take it from 0 to 1 myself and really give it everything that I had. And so that was something that we'd started in undergrad. It didn't really get off the ground, but that was the first foray into proper entrepreneurship. And then since then have dabbled in a couple of smaller projects after that and in grad school as well.
Yeah. I guess the case remains true that it's rarely people's first business that takes off. So it's the multiple time founders that get it done. I can kind of predict what your answer is going to be here, but I'm going to ask you anyways. What is your advice for MBAs that are looking to sort of break into a more technical space? Short of somebody learning how to code like you did and doing it, what are maybe some of the ways to get involved that you've seen could have a lot of value for people coming out of an MBA program?
So there's this notion that being technical or non-technical is binary. And I'd challenge that. In my head, it lies much more on a spectrum, and I'd heavily encourage folks to pull themselves towards the more technical end of the spectrum. So become technical is my answer. And there's no magic behind it, or everyone who is technical had to learn to be technical at one stage. So I would say really it's reading up on white papers, messing around in Jupyter notebooks, getting yourself just exposed to a lot of the technical aspects that are inherent to the AI space is really important. And I would say that really there is no magic box to it. It's knowing your customers and knowing your product, and AI is fundamentally technical. And so to dive deeper into that is really important. And just to have an energy and drive about the product. If you're super interested in it, then reading up on it is going to be an absolute breeze. I'd suggest that for people who are wanting to break into AI is to just know your product, know your customers well, and just bring yourself toward the more technical end of that spectrum if that's necessary.
I think that's good advice. And for those who are still at Wharton listening to this podcast, there is a class on Python that I took this past quarter, which I thought was super sort of informative to get at least your feet wet into some things and play in Jupyter notebooks, like Liam said. So good piece of advice there. Final question that I have for you is, or two questions maybe, is what is your biggest takeaway from starting a company or biggest learning? And then what is the future of Proxis? You guys are at a really exciting time, or YC just ended up. So if you could maybe share some news on what's going to change in coming years or months, I guess, we'd love to hear it.
So on the learnings from a startup, a couple of years ago, we were doing a tracking course in South Africa. We were training under one of the world's most renowned trackers, and a guy by the name of Renius and Hlongo. This one afternoon, we're tracking down a herd of elephant, and we were following their footsteps in the sand, and we'd lost their footsteps at one stage. And I remember Renius saying, I don't know where I'm going, but I know exactly how to get there. And for me, that is directly applicable to the startup space as well, where I don't know what the final form product will look like 10 years down the line, but I know if I know that the core problem of that customer well, and if I follow the axioms well enough, then I know exactly how I'm going to get there, even though I'm not sure of the final product. And during that afternoon as well, we'd gone off on a different track. We'd each take turns tracking, and we'd gone off on a wrong path. And Renius said, this is the path of not here. And being on the path of not here and losing that track is still as important as eventually it's part of the process of finding the track. Backtracking to where you last saw the last one and then carrying on from there. And that for me was also super important of in the startup space, hey, 90% of the time, 95% of the time it's going to feel like you're failing. And really that's on the path to success, where if you take, for example, a seed raise where you meet with 100 investors, 95 of those investors are no, but you end up raising a $5 million seed from the last 5. That's a successful raise. But when you're in the trenches, a lot of it feels like being punched in the solar plexus and being able to keep coming back after those no's. And that's the path of not here, is ultimately finding that path. So for me, that's been a big learning from being in the startup space. And because of that, the gist is survive long enough in order to succeed. If you keep shipping products and you stay in the startup game for long enough, then eventually we will overcome those no's and succeed. In terms of where Proxis is going long term, like I mentioned, we are really foundational models are built to be generalist. And our unique insight is that companies don't need generalist models. They're very specific use cases that they're building for. And what we're building here is those custom verticals to cater to those use cases. If you're a healthcare company, you have a small set of data, and you want a really highly custom model for your chatbot or whatever you're building in-house, is really where Proxis comes in, because we have those verticalized models and ultimately those verticalized agents that we'll be rolling out. And that's where we see it going. It's almost like it's on OpenAI's 5-step plan to AGI, where suddenly we've gone past the LLMs toward the agentic workflows, and we're there to build to custom verticals along each of those parts of the plan. That's where we see it going forward. But like I say, it's really is a saying of, I don't know where we're going, but I know exactly how to get there. And that final form is not yet cemented, but we know exactly what to do along the way to get there.
Awesome. I couldn't picture a more Liam response to that question. So it was right on red. I absolutely loved it. And I love doing this episode. Thank you so much for joining. And I know you're probably super busy right now, so I really appreciate the time and looking forward to hearing how the journey goes.
Great seeing you again, Julian. Thanks very much.
Cheers.